Hello and greetings to all of our viewers. Thank you for being here with us. And I'm glad to begin this special series on ancient Jewish magic, witchcraft, demons, and disease. So I want to begin with this special item, an incantation bowl from the National Library of Israel collection. Now next week we will focus on these items and discuss them at length. So now I will just say that this is part of a large corpus of texts dated to the 5th or to 7th century CE, the time of the redaction of the Babylonian Talmud. And this is an archaeological finding, some provenance and others non-provenance, of Jewish items intended to fight witchcraft, demons, and disease, and to protect households from all of these various things that could harm people. Now, most of these bowls were written in Jewish Babylonian Aramaic, and as you could see on your screen, in square Hebrew letters. So I want to begin with part of the text of one such bowl that is intended for a woman named Mahaduch, who is suffering from something that maybe some of you at home suffer from too occasionally, and that is some sort of a migraine. And again, this is a text from about 1500 years ago. So I'm reading from Dan Levine's edition, and I'll read some of the text, and this will be a good introduction to our series. May there be healing from heaven for Mahaduch, daughter of Ninduch. Again, I adjure you and beswear you, evil spirit, that you should not go and not become to Mahaduch, daughter of Ninduch, neither a companion of the night or of the day. For if you go and persecute the body, head, the eye sockets of Mahaduch, daughter of Ninduch, you, evil spirit, they will ban you and break you and excommunicate you, just as mighty fortified cities were broken against which Nuriel and Raphael and Michael were sent. So we have this list of different adjurations and different things that are really trying to aim at making this headache go away. Now, we are dealing with antiquity, so the headache is understood as evil spirits who are now haunting this Mahaduch. And the way to really remove these demons is to call upon the angels and also to ban and excommunicate the various demons that are troubling Mahaduch. Now, what we're going to ask in this series is, what is this incantation bowl? When Mahaduch went to purchase this bowl, is this considered sorcery? Is this considered what we know as kishuf? And if it isn't, what is considered forbidden kishuf? What is considered witchcraft? What is considered legitimate? And what is considered not legitimate? And if this isn't kishuf, so who are the people who were producing these amulets? Who are the people who were writing them? Who were these magicians or sorcerers? What was their place in society? And what is the relationship between them and other religious elites, such as the rabbis at this time, who were responsible for rabbinic literature? And in addition, what were the rabbinic attitudes towards what we may call magical practices? Were they frowned upon? Were they forbidden? Or were they sometimes considered legitimate? So these are some of the questions that we're going to deal with. And today we're going to speak about witches and witchcraft in ancient Jewish sources, in the Hebrew Bible, and later in rabbinic sources. Next week we will speak about how to deal with demons via Jewish magical amulets and bowls, again from late antiquity, something like the 4th to 7th century CE, the time of the composition of much of rabbinic literature. And the third session will be about Talmudic, medical, and magical healing. What do we see in rabbinic literature? What kind of healings are there for either a disease or a demon? And what is the relationship between these various types of healings and the magic material that we will read and that we read from the bowl for Mahaduch? So before I begin, I want to give some reading recommendations because obviously this series is just touching upon a huge subject in the scholarly field of ancient Jewish magic. Of course, there was also magic in the Middle Ages and in modern times and also in modern day. But for this specific time period that we are dealing with in the series, meaning antiquity or late antiquity, there are three very important books. First of all, the oldest book out of the three is Joshua Trachtenberg's Jewish Magic and Superstition, which is a very important book, but much has been done since then, especially with the groundbreaking work of Gideon Boak and Yuval Harari. Both wrote very important books, and much of the things that I will be showing and saying in this series is heavily influenced from their very important research. Gideon Boak's Ancient Jewish Magic and Yuval Harari's Jewish Magic Before the Rise of Kabbalah, or the Hebrew version, HaKishuf HaYehudi HaKadum. So if this topic is interesting for you, that's a good place to start, these three books. And if you finish these books, I have further recommendations for you. So now we will begin with witchcraft and sorcery, the biblical prohibitions. So many times when I have a class and I start speaking about ancient Jewish magic, the first thing that someone will raise their hand and say, wait, but magic is forbidden according to the Jewish religion, according to the Bible. So what I want first to do is deal with the biblical prohibitions to understand exactly what is prohibited and how exactly it is defined. And then we will be able to move with that information towards antiquity, towards late antiquity, towards rabbinic literature, and towards the magical artifacts. So I'll begin by reading from Deuteronomy 18, where we find the most detailed list of the prohibited actions that have to do with witchcraft and sorcery. So I'm reading from the English translation, according to the New Revised Standard Version. When you come into the land that the Lord your God is giving you, you must not learn to imitate the abhorrent practices of those nations. No one shall be found among you who makes a son or daughter pass through fire, or who practices divination, or is a soothsayer, or a nagur, or a sorcerer, or one who casts spells, or who consults ghosts or spirits, or who seeks oracles from the dead. For whoever does these things is abhorrent to the Lord. It is because of such abhorrent practices that the Lord your God is driving them out before you. You must remain completely loyal to the Lord your God. Although these nations that you are about to dispossess do give heed to soothsayers, and diviners, as for you, the Lord your God does not permit you to do so. The Lord your God will raise for you a prophet like me from among your own people. You shall heed such a prophet. So we find what's highlighted in the presentation, the list of the different practices that are forbidden. Now, it's very important to emphasize that this is a translation, and as with any translation, it's also a commentary, because, for example, when we have either kosem ksamim or mechashef, and then the translation practices divination or sorcerer, it is not entirely clear that the translation really is a reflection of the biblical prohibition. Same goes, for example, for the chover chaver. So here we have one in the beginning of verse 11, one who casts spells, but in practice we see, for example, in rabbinic literature, that chover chaver is often understood as someone who brings things together to one place. So we first of all have to understand that this list is the translation of the list, and also for those of you who are reading in Hebrew, also to read in Hebrew and to exactly understand what is the meaning here is not entirely clear. But except for that, I wanted you to notice the context in which this list is brought. So you can see that it is brought when God is talking about coming into the land that God is giving, and most importantly, the comparison between those that are not legitimate, those that you can't go to, who are the practitioners of the people of the land, versus who you can seek, and that is the prophet, the Navi Mikirbecha. That is the one that you can seek, and it's important to notice that the problem here is mainly, at least according to the context, the problem is that these specific practices are the ones, these abhorrent practices are the ones of those nations that you are supposed to replace them in the land. And this is something I want you to remember throughout this specific presentation, the distinction between our practices and the other practices, what is legitimate and what is not legitimate, who gave the authority, is it from God or is it from local practitioners? And this is something we will see again and again. Another well-known verse that we find has to do with the female witch or female sorcerer, the machshefa. And here too, it is important to see the context. So I'll read the verses that are before you. When a man seduces a virgin who is not engaged to be married and lies with her, he shall give the bride price for her and make her his wife. But if her father refuses to give her to him, he shall pay an amount equal to the bride price for virgins. You shall not permit a female sorcerer to live. Whoever lies with an animal shall be put to death. Whoever sacrifices to any god other than the Lord alone shall be devoted to destruction. So here too, notice the context of the prohibition or even more so, of the punishment of the female sorcerer who is supposed to be killed. It is brought after the verses regarding rape and before the verses regarding lying with an animal, and it seems to be here also something that has to do with maybe sexual actions, or in any case, something from this context. And regarding the gender, the machshefa, the female sorcerer, this is something we will see later. And of course, we know throughout history the connection between females and witchcraft. So when we look at the different things we saw, on the one hand, I brought some of the prohibitions. There are a few further verses, again, in such contexts in the Hebrew Bible. But I want to also think about other stories in the Hebrew Bible, which we do not necessarily put together in the context of witchcraft. But first I will talk about one witch of Endor, or as we know her as the Baalat Ov, that brought up the dead for King Shaul. And when we look at that story, we note that when Shaul comes to the witch of Endor, she, when we look according to the Hebrew Bible and not the later medieval commentaries that dispute the matter, we see that what she does actually works. The story in Kings, it doesn't give us it doesn't reflect. In Shmuel, it doesn't reflect that we don't believe that the witch of Endor existed, or that it was just an optical illusion, as we will see soon some examples of optical illusions, but rather it was a real thing, it was a real action, but it is something that is prohibited. It is not one of she was not a prophet, and it's not someone that that the king was permitted to go to. Now, except for her, she's obviously illegitimate and a witch, we have many stories in the Bible that we could look at in eyes that are, if we just look at the practice and not at who's doing it, we may just think that this looks like a magical act. So I gave just two examples. I could have given a lot more. One is for Elisha, the prophet, and the bears, the story of the children who mocked Elisha, and that he cursed him, and then the bears, as you could see before you, devoured the children. Another story is the bronze serpent. We have the story of Israel, who, after they left Egypt, when they complained, one of their complaints in the desert, so they were brought upon snakes and different scorpions, and the healing that Moses was said to give them was to look at this bronze serpent. And later in the Bible, we also have the story that it was later idolized, and of course, this was something very problematic. But if we just look at the method using a serpent and then people looking at the serpent and healing, or other examples, Passover is coming soon, so examples of Moses and Aaron in Egypt doing the various miracles with the staff and the various competitions between Moses and the Egyptian sorcerers, we could see that a lot of times the action itself, when we take away the context, if we just look at the action, it could have looked like something that we would, in a different context, define as a magical act. And then we have to start thinking, what makes us call something magic and what makes us call something miracle? What is the difference? What is the inherent difference that makes something a magical act, that makes the Witch of Endor doing something sorcery or magic, whereas the prophets are doing something that is considered a miracle? How exactly do we define it? And something that we see here and that we'll see again in the rabbinic sources is that there's a big difference who is doing the action. Is the person doing the action someone that has the authority, someone within the religion, someone who was chosen, or is it someone that is outside of this authoritative circle, if it's a woman or a non-Jew or someone else? And this would already be considered something that is prohibited and something that constitutes as sorcery. So I want to move on to rabbinic literature, and the rabbis too contemplate the question of what exactly is sorcery. So first off, we have the Mishnah, the 2nd century CE rabbinic compilation, and it reads, this Mishnah from Tractate Sanhedrin: the sorcerer, mechashef, is one who performs a deed. In Hebrew, oseh maaseh. He is liable to death by stoning, but not he who creates an optical illusion. Okay, so there's first of all a distinction between someone who actually performs a deed, who actually does something, we're going to soon see examples, and someone who creates an optical illusion, which would be closer to what we see today as a magic trick. So Rabbi Akiva said in the name of Rabbi Yoshua, 2 men gather cucumbers. One gathers and is exempt, while the other gathers and is liable. He who performs a deed is liable, to death, to stoning, but he who creates an optical illusion is exempt. So first off, we have this distinction between the actual deed and the optical illusion. The example brought is from gathering cucumbers, and we'll see further examples of this agriculture magic. And I want to note that, of course, in a pre-modern society, agricultural society, when we have people working in the fields, this is a very, very important, if you know how to do this, this is a great benefit. And if we would think of modern context, maybe we would think of someone who with a word could understand what's happening in the stock market, etc. So obviously someone who could gather the cucumbers in a word, as we shall soon see, this is really something that is important in such a society. So the Babylonian Talmud, so from the Sasanian Empire, compiled, redacted as something like 500 CE, continues to elaborate on what is considered sorcery and what is not. So Abaye says, halachot of sorcery are like the halachot of Shabbat. There are some of them for which one is liable to stoning. There are some of them for which one is exempt from punishment, but it is forbidden, and some of them that are permitted from the outset. Okay, so there's three categories, and it's very interesting that Abaye begins by comparing the halachot of sorcery to the halachot of Shabbat. So there's very different kinds of these halachot. There's ones that totally exempt from punishment, one is that is forbidden, and some are permitted from the outset. Sorry, we will soon see. One is exempt from punishment but forbidden. So one who performs a deed, oseh maaseh, is liable to be executed by stoning. This is something that is completely prohibited. One who creates an optical illusion is exempt from punishment, but is prohibited for him to do so. So if someone is what we would call maybe a modern, magician who is doing a magic trick, he is exempt from punishment, but it is prohibited. It is frowned upon. So sorry for those out there who are magicians themselves. Permitted from the outset is like Rav Chanina and Rav Oshaya, who would sit every Shabbat Eve and study the halachot of creation, in some versions the book of creation, and a third grown calf would be created for them and they would eat it. So something that is totally permitted is like Rav Chanina and Rav Oshaya, two rabbis who sat every Shabbat Eve and studied the halachot of creation. Much has been written about what exactly this is, but in any case, for our purposes, they are studying this most probably esoteric knowledge, and a third grown calf is created, and they are permitted to eat it. There is no problem with that. And also note that the people here, and this has to do with the what we said about the Hebrew Bible, the people that is permitted for them are, of course, the rabbis. Now, I wanted to give some examples of these optical illusions, ochezet ha'enayim, like also the modern phrase achizat enayim. This is the word used. So I think that if I were to ask you now of examples of optical illusions from magic tricks, I think one of the most, something that comes to mind is, for example, taking a rabbit out of a hat. You might have other examples of card tricks, etc. So it's interesting to see what are the examples of the Babylonian Talmud. Again, we're talking about 1,500 years ago in Babylonia, modern day Iraq. So what are their examples of optical illusions? Rav Ashi said, I saw the father of Karna who blew his nose and casted rolls of silk from his nostrils. Okay, you may know similar tricks from modern times. Rav said to Rav Chia, I myself saw an Arabian take a sword and cut up a camel. Then he beat a drum and the camel arose. Okay, so he was telling him of something that he saw. Who knows, maybe it was in the market, maybe in a carnival, that an Arabian took a sword, cut up the camel, and when he beat his drum, the camel, even though he was cut, was able to rise. And so Rav Chia answered, he asks them, after that, was there any blood or dung? Rather, that was merely an optical illusion. He tells them this is not real, this is actually some sort of magic trick. I thought it was interesting to show you something, we're going 1,000 years forward, but we're still 500 years behind us, of an illustration from a 16th century composition, a skeptical book written by an English man by the name of Reginald Scott, who's tried to expose early modern witchcraft. And it was Scott. He believed that this was really irrational and not Christian, so he wanted to expose the various tricks. And you could see here a trick that you might know something similar from modern times, cutting a person in two, where he exposes that actually the trick is that they're two different people, and this is a very early illustration. So we see that these kind of magic tricks are something that we could find throughout history, from what we saw in the Talmud in 500 CE till in the 16th century, and you might have seen similar things in modern day. So going back to the Talmud, the rabbis give other examples about the thing that is prohibited, and that is performing a deed. So, when Rabbi Eliezer fell sick, Rabbi Akiva and his companions went to visit him. And Rabbi Eliezer said, I have studied 300, and the Talmud here adds, some state 3,000, rulings about the planting of cucumbers. And no man except Akiva ben Yosef ever questioned me about it. For it once happened that he and I were walking together on a road, when he said to me, "My master, teach me about planting of cucumbers." I said one word, and the whole field was filled with cucumbers. Then he said, "Master, you have taught me how to plant them. Now teach me how to uproot them." I said something, and all the cucumbers gathered in one place. So Rabbi Eliezer is telling the story about him and Rabbi Akiva walking, and Rabbi Akiva asks him to teach him something from the 300, or some say 3,000, rulings of planting cucumbers. He says, Rabbi Eliezer says one word, and the cucumbers are planted, and Rabbi Akiva asks him to know how to uproot them, how to collect them, and he said one other word, and they were gathered in one place. Now, again, I emphasize how important this is in an agriculture society before all of the industrial revolution. So after we hear this story, and we already know that it is prohibited to perform a deed, and Rabbi Eliezer said a word, so he did perform a deed, the Talmud asks, but how did Rabbi Eliezer do this? Did we not learn that if one performs a deed of sorcery, he is liable? So how could he have done something that is considered sorcery and that is liable, that one who does it liable for stoning? So the Gemara answers, if it is only to teach, it is different. For it has been said, thou shalt not learn to do after the abominations of these nations. You may not learn in order to practice, but you may learn in order to understand and instruct. So the rabbis say, yes, this is something that is prohibited when you are going to do this. But if you are just doing it for the sake of learning, for the sake of understanding, that is okay. And as I said from the beginning, when we make this distinction between the authority and the non-legitimate people, so the people who are learning about this are the rabbis, and they have this knowledge and they use it for teaching. And it is even said that in the Sanhedrin, in the great court, there, the people who sit there have to know 70 languages and have to know and should be ba'alei kshafim, that they know of the sorcery. So this really is the science in a way of their time. And then the rabbis are supposed to know how to do this, but of course use it only for learning purposes. Another exemption we have for the prohibition of sorcery is everything that is connected to healing. So I will read from the Talmud, from the Mishnah and the Talmud from Tractate Shabbat, and this is something we will go back to in the third meeting of this session, which is about medical and magical healing. So the Mishnah states, it is permitted to go out on Shabbat. Now, I should say for context that in Shabbat, it is prohibited to go from place to place while going from the private sphere to the public sphere, carrying items. But there are different exemptions, for example, jewelry, etc. And now the Mishnah the context is different exemptions. So it is permitted to go out on Shabbat with the locust egg and with the tooth of a fox and with a nail from the crucified for the purpose of healing. This is the statement of Rabbi Meir. But the rabbis prohibit the use of these items even during the week because it violates the ways of the Amorite, Darkei Amori. So we see here one rabbinic opinion stating that it is permitted to walk with these various items. Soon the Talmud will explain why it is helpful to walk with these items, to go out with these items. But the rabbis, the rabbinic opinion that is brought later prohibits the use of these items even during the week because it violates the Darkei Amori, the ways of the Amorite. As we saw in the biblical prohibition, the ways of the Amorite are something that you're not supposed to do. So this is forbidden, and we have in another rabbinic composition from the Tannaitic period, from the Tosefta, we have lists of the different practices that are considered the ways of the Amorite. So the Talmud explains what these different objects how they could help a person. So one may go out with a locust egg as they use it to cure earaches, and with the tooth of a fox as they use it for sleep. A live fox tooth, okay, if you take the tooth out when the fox is alive, it's for one who sleeps too much. And a dead fox tooth, it's for one who does not sleep, which I guess in a way it's better because it's probably easier to get a tooth out of a dead fox. Not that I tried, but I assume so. And a nail from the crucified for a skin infection. Now, this is very interesting. I'm not sure I would recommend this at home, but the Talmud suggests that a nail from the crucified, yes, the punishment of crucifixion, this is something that could heal a skin infection. So for the purpose of healing is the statement of Rabbi Meir. Now, Abaye and Rava both say anything that contains an element of healing does not constitute a violation of the ways of the Amorites. So we find here a very significant exemption for what is considered sorcery. Anything that heals is fine. It does not constitute the ways of the Amorite. This might remind you of pikuach nefesh, that you are allowed to violate, for example, to not observe the Shabbat if someone could be cured. So in the same way, this statement really tells us that anything that can help a person heal is permitted. So I want to take us back to the bowl we saw in the beginning of the presentation and to ask where we would put this. If you could see, for those of you at home, in the middle, in the circle, there's one word that says where the incantation begins, and the word is Asuta. Yeah, Asuta means Shmaya, healing from the heaven. So a lot of these bowls and a lot of amulets in general are intended for healing. So when we think about the questions that I presented in the beginning of the series, is this witchcraft? Is this magic? So at least according to the rabbis, if something is considered, it's brought for healing, according to Abaye v'Rava, there is no problem, and it is a legitimate practice. So these bowls should, in fact, constitute something that is not problematic, and we will return to these questions next week. So I spoke a bit about how rabbis understood the prohibition of sorcery, and now I want to talk about two stories from the Talmud Yerushalmi, from the Talmud of the land of Israel, that actually tell us of rabbis who meet sorcerers and have a sort of duel between them, a sort of feud, and we could learn something from these stories. So we see some of the rabbis we already met before. And this is the story of the bathhouse of Tiberius. So Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yoshua, and Rabbi Akiva went to bathe in the bathhouses of Tiberius. They saw a certain non-Jew. The Aramaic here, or the Hebrew actually, is the word min, which is sometimes translated as Christian, but in any case, it was a non-Jew. He said what he said, this non-Jew, and they were caught up under the arched ceiling of the bathhouse. So he says some sort of magical spell, as we would call it, and the rabbis get caught up in the ceiling of the bathhouse. Rabbi Eliezer said to Rabbi Yoshua, Yoshua ben Hanania, see what you can do. So they wanted him, Yoshua ben Hanania, to act upon this when they are stuck in the air. So when the non-Jew tried to leave, Rabbi Yoshua said what he said, and he was caught by the gate. So meaning the non-Jew was also caught, and now caught up in the gate, and now the rabbis and the non-Jews are both in mid-air. But his situation was a bit worse because he was on the gate. So whoever entered the bathhouse struck him, and whoever departed pushed him. Of course, it's a comical scene that the non-Jew, the sorcerer, is stuck there on the gate, and everyone that comes in hits him, actually. So he asked the rabbis, undo what you have done. Ashare, yeah, loosen, hatiru, what you have done. And you see that he can't undo the action that the rabbis did himself, just as the rabbis are stuck there and they can't undo what he did. So they say, you undo what you have done, and then we will also undo it. So both undid what they did. So they both returned their magical spells so they could get back to the ground. When they went out, Rabbi Yoshua said to the non-Jew, is this what you know how to do? That's all? That's what you know how to do? He said, let us go down to the sea. When they went down to the sea, the non-Jew said what he said, and the sea split. I said that Passover is coming soon, so this is very relevant. He said to them, did not Moses, your master, do just this to the sea? He's boasting that he can split the sea just as Moses did. They said to him, but do you not admit that Moses, our master, also walked in it? He said to them, yes. So they said to him, so walk in it. He walked in it, and Rabbi Yoshua decreed upon the minister of the sea, and the sea swallowed him. So the rabbis cunningly bring the non-Jew to the waters and make him boast that he can split the sea just as Moses did. And then when he's in the water, they do something else. They don't use the word, it doesn't say that they did what they did, that they used a magic spell. Rather, they decreed upon the minister of the sea, Rabbi Yoshua gazar al sarayam, they decreed upon him, and the sea swallowed him. So here we see something new. It's not just that the rabbis are proficient in the different magical spells, rather they also know how to use their authority to decree in order to force the sea to listen to them, to do something. And here we see that the rabbis they also know, the science of the sorcerers, but they have the upper hand because they have the authority to decree. And we see a very interesting story, and a similar story also in the Talmud Yerushalmi, in Sanhedrin, this time with a female witch. So the same trio, Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yoshua, and Rabban Gamliel, travel to Rome, and I skipped this part, but they understand that there are Jews there, and they see one old Jew who says to them, pray for my son who does not have a child. Rabbi Eliezer said to Rabbi Yoshua, what now, Yoshua, son of Hananiah? See what you can do. How can you help this young man who did not bear a child? So Rabbi Yoshua asked for the following things. He said to them, bring me a seed of flax. So they brought him a seed of flax. He appeared to be sowing it on a stone plate. He appeared to water it. It appeared to grow. He appeared to uproot it until he pulled up a woman with the braids of her hair. So we have this action, and it's very interesting that the Talmud doesn't say he grew he grew it and sowed it and watered it. They use the verb itchame, the Jewish Palestinian Aramaic, it was seen to them as if, maybe this has to do with what we said before, that it is prohibited to do a magical deed, but in any case, it appears that he is planting something, and in a very fast way, he pulls up this woman from the braids of her hair, who was supposedly the person who was at fault for this poor young man who can't have a child. He said to her, undo what you did. She said to him, I will not undo it. He said to her, if not, I will expose you. She said to him, I cannot undo it, for they were thrown into the sea. So you have this witch who is there. And again, we see something very interesting, that the rabbi can't just come and solve it, and solve this situation. He needs the witch to undo what she did. And this has to do with what we know about ancient magical practitioners. We also know of this specific curse of young males who, in Hebrew, it's called kshirat chatanim, a very specific curse for young husbands that causes impotence. And the rabbi needs him to undo it. And he also tells her that he will expose her. So we understand that it is not good to be a witch, because that's a sort of threat against the witch, that he will expose her. But she says that she can't, because what she did is she threw them into the sea. Now, what does this mean? This probably has to do with the way she did her curse. Now, if you could imagine some sort of voodoo doll or something like that, that she did, and then she threw it into the sea, exactly for the purpose that it will be something final, that this young man won't be able to have a child. But again, after he understood, Rabbi Yoshua, that the different items were in the sea, Yoshua decreed upon the prince of the sea, and he spat them out. Gazar al sarayam, and the different objects were cast out, and we understand from this that the curse could be undone. He prayed for him, the host, and he merited to raise Rabbi Yehuda, son of Betera. This is the happy ending, of course. They said, if we came here only to raise this righteous man, Yehuda, son of Betera, it would suffice for us. So we have these two stories, right? We have these two stories that position the rabbis against the sorcerers as the people, the heroes, of course, against the people who are doing these unjust actions, especially the second one. But we do learn a few things, such as I mentioned, that the witches and the sorcerers, they have to undo their own actions. And again, if you remember what I said about the witch of Endor, it's not that we don't believe that these actions really exist, that these things can really be done. But the rabbis have the upper hand. And how do they have the upper hand? Also because they know how to do these different spells. You know, if someone makes them fly in the air, they're going to make the other person fly in the air, and they could bring out the witch from planting this plant on a table. They know how to do these things. And as we said, it's permitted to learn these various actions. But another thing is that they have the upper hand because they have the authority to decree upon the natural forces, upon the sea in this case. And we have different cases in rabbinic literature of decrees against demons and against other things that the rabbis really have the upper hand. Now, we have to imagine a historical context where there were where alongside rabbis, there were all sorts of different miracle workers who said that they could do all these different things, if it's healing or cursing or making people fly, etc. And the rabbis here position themselves as the stronger and more authoritative and legitimate authority that also knows, you know, the general knowledge of magic, but also has something more. Now, because I mentioned the witch, I did want to touch upon the gendered aspects of sorcery, because of course we know that witch hunting is something from the Middle Ages, etc. But we see various different aspects. We already saw it in the Hebrew Bible with the Mechashefa lo techayeh, and also in rabbinic literature, and many stories that I didn't bring, such as the Rabbi Shimon ben Shatach and the witches of Ashkelon, and other stories. And I do want to just note that this is, of course, again, a much later manuscript, but it's interesting. This is actually part of a manuscript of a composition, which is a defense of women in response to these classical attacks on women, that they were witches and sorcerers, etc. So I brought a few examples of rabbinic literature and the various statements against women and sorcery. So we have in Mishnah Avot, the more wives, the more witchcraft. Yeah, marbe nashim, marbe kshafim. So there is a correlation between having more wives and that there will be more witchcraft. We have in the Babylonian Talmud and Tractate Sanhedrin a question about why the biblical verse that we read about that female sorcerers should not live, the Talmud asks, why does it say female sorcerers? Why does it say machashefa lo techayeh and not, for example, mechashef lo techayeh, a sorcerer? And they say because most women engage in sorcery. Rov nashim lekshafim. This is something that is that we know that it is something of female actions to engage in sorcery. And now, if I look at Mishnah Avot and the Talmud and Sanhedrin, we could say that maybe these are sentences that have to do more with, in their opinion, the right way to live, but not actually law or something more didactic in nature, and not actually halacha, a law. But there are places that this also has an actual meaning in terms of legal context. So, for example, in Tractate Brachot, we have, in the context of a discussion that has to do with the blessing for smell, that one who was walking outside a city and smelled a scent, if the majority of the town's residents are Gentiles, he may not recite a blessing over the scent. So if someone is walking and he smells something, but most of the city there is Gentiles, he can't say the blessing because it could be that that the scent has to do with idolatry, so he won't be able to say the blessing. But if the majority are Jews, he may recite a blessing. Rabbi Yosei said, even if the majority are Jews, one may not recite a blessing, as the daughters of Israel burn incense to witchcraft. So even if, according to Rabbi Yosei, even if most of the townspeople are Jewish, you cannot say this blessing, because women, you do not know what they are doing, and it could be that they're actually burning incense to witchcraft. And for this, the Talmud afterwards asked, most of the daughters of Israel? And not everyone agrees with this statement, but the statement is brought as is, and this has to do with other stories that we won't have time to go into, that really, for example, a story about the daughters of Rav Nachman, an important rabbi, that they themselves were witches. So witches can be connected to women also within even the daughters of rabbis, within the community, because the women still have something that is inherently connected to witchcraft. Now, this has to do with what we saw from the discussions of the Hebrew Bible, which there is a difference between the knowledge that is with the authority, that is considered legitimate knowledge, and the knowledge of the other. The woman is many times the ultimate other. She is doing something, we don't know what she is doing, and it could be that it is indeed witchcraft, or the non-Jew. And this has to do with when I asked what is the difference between the stories of Moses and the staff and the different prophets, what is the difference between that and other magical actions? And someone who really framed this interestingly is Jacob Neusner, who said the sentence, "What I do is a miracle and what you do is magic." So when someone from the authoritative context is doing something, this is an action, some sort of action that may seem supernatural, this is a miracle. But when another person is doing it, and especially someone who is not from that circle, be it a woman or a non-Jew or someone that is not part of the authoritative circle, that is magic and that is sorcery. So we have to be very attuned to when texts and ancient texts speak about sorcery, are we really seeing something that has to do with the actions themselves or with the context? Because at least in this period, I'm not talking about modern reclaimings of magic and witchcraft, but someone won't say about himself, I am a sorcerer, ani machashef, or ani machshefa, I am a sorceress. We saw in that story from the Yerushalmi that the rabbis say, we are going to expose you if you don't undo what you do. It's something that no one wants to be a sorcerer or a sorceress, and this is really othering the people, other practitioners that have some sort of forces to do different deeds. So in order to leave time for questions, I want to give a brief conclusions of the various things we spoke about. So we had the biblical prohibition, and I wanted you to note the context that these are indeed supernatural practices. But the context is really the othering. It has to do with the people who are living in the land of Israel, or it has to do with the women. And the problem is really the force and the authority that comes with it, and not necessarily the specific practices that maybe a rabbi could do in another context and it will be okay, or a prophet, etc. When we saw the different stories of rabbis versus sorcerers, that the rabbis positioned themselves as people who know how to do these various things. They know how to gather the cucumbers better than anyone else. They know how to do these various actions, but they are struggling with these different sorcerers or sorceresses, but at the end they have the upper hand because they have the authority to decree. And we also saw that there are many exemptions from practicing sorcery. So if I began by saying, in Judaism, maybe magic is something that is prohibited, that's true, but not if it's an optical illusion or for studying or for medicine. And then we see that there's a lot of different exemptions. And finally, it is important that when we talk about sorcery or when we talk about kishuf, we have to note that we are speaking with our modern definitions of magic. When I read the different medical healings of a nail of a crucified or a fox tooth, this may not be the first thing that comes to mind. When you can't sleep, you won't go to a fox and take out his tooth. But this has to do with our modern definitions, and we should be very aware and try to learn these texts within the historical and social context with they were written. So thank you, and I'm open to questions if there were any.
We have the audience here. I have a question from the audience regarding the bowl you showed at the beginning, but maybe you'll be speaking about that next week. What did people actually do with the bowl? Drink from it, eat from it, or what was done with them?
Okay, so next week, bowls and metal amulets will be our focus, but so you will be able to sleep at night. I will tell you that they were buried, usually face down, and that's how they came to us in modern times, either from archaeological excavations or from the market, but it was because they were buried, usually in the openings of the house. But you are welcome to join us next week, and I will be happy to elaborate more.
Most of the stories you mentioned from the Talmud were about men who did magic. In ancient times, was magic considered more of a manly, male trait, or were women also involved?
Okay, so that really ties into to what we have seen at the end, that on the one case, we maybe will pile together everything with magic practices, but there are certain things that men do in this period. For example, we'll see magic that has to do with writing and writing amulets, but we can see from these stories that women also engaged in different practices. It can be practices that have to do with the use of natural substances or others. So of course it has to do with how we would define magic, but we do see from the rabbinic literature and also from the magical texts themselves that there are various magical practices that male engaged in, and there were also things that women did in this regard.
Okay, there are quite a few questions regarding the nail of the crucifixion. Could you explain why it has magic quality, and when did the custom to use this begin?
This is a great question. Unfortunately, the question is better than the answer. So we find it in the Mishnah, and we see that the Talmud explains the use of it as something that has to do with skin disease, but I do not know where exactly this came from. I mean, we do find different materials that have to do also later with the dead. So this could be connected, but I do not know specifically when this came to be.
All right. Do you have anything specific to say about the prophet Hulda, who is a female rather than the other male prophets we know?
Yeah, well, that's a good question, because it could have seemed from my presentation that females can never be part of the authority. And we really see that, at least in the Hebrew Bible, we have Dvorah and we have Huldah. So we do see that there are these women, less so in rabbinic literature, although one can mention maybe a few women as well. So this, of course, would be considered something that is legitimate and definitely not something that is considered magic or sorcery.
All right, another question. Is this view of magic derived from an early period where the Jews emulated other people around them? Was it also a popular non-Jewish culture?
So magic, or what we define as magic, was very popular all across the ancient world. We could see this if we're talking about, the rabbinic period. We have much writing of Greco-Roman magical literature. We have Christian magic, and virtually everybody used these various techniques. We have to understand that it was pre-modern and also medieval medicine, and people who were suffering, for example, someone has, we see this also in the gospel, someone has an epileptic attack, okay? So when you see someone who is suddenly falling on the floor with foam at his mouth, etc., it seems quite, maybe for us, we could explain it in modern medical terms, but for someone viewing this, it seems quite logical that actually a demon entered this individual, and we have to take out the demon in order for this person to stop having this epileptic attack. So when there is such a strong belief in demons, the way to combat the demons is the use of the magic, what we would call magic, and amulets. And so it was really across the ancient world. Sometimes Jews influence their neighbors. Sometimes the neighbors influence the Jews. We could see cross-cultural contacts from antiquity to modern times.
In early Christian faith, the relics of saints were seen to have healing powers. Is there a parallel in the Jewish world?
That's interesting, because when there was a question about the nail of the crucifixion, that was what I was thinking about, and I didn't bring it up. So maybe this is a parallel. Specific relics, well, we know from later times, and we know this from today, that people go to graves of famous rabbis and pray there. Yes, this is something very, very common. And there are different practices that have to do with the graveyard already in ancient times.